Hi, this is Rick from For Community, creating community spaces so you can connect with others and also with God. Well, this video begins our survey of the Old Testament. I've discerned that not a lot of us are aware of what's going on in the Old Testament, and it would take forever to go through the whole thing. We can go through the New Testament pretty quickly. So what's the best way to figure out what's in the Old Covenant? Through survey. So on the last Sunday of each month, as long as this is something you want, as long as you like me doing this, if I get positive feedback for this, I'm going to continue an Old Testament survey, one book at a time. And I'm beginning with the book of Genesis. Start at the very beginning. So give me some feedback. Make sure you like it. And as long as the discussions also go well on Zoom for the two groups that I lead on Sundays, we're going to keep it going. So as you are reading the book of Genesis, the book that you find very first in the Bible, there are three key concepts to keep in mind while you're reading. The first key concept to keep in mind while you're reading Genesis is the idea of the covenant. The covenant is something that God is using as his program of revelation. I'm going to explain that in a little more detail, but the gist is that at that moment of creation, at some point during creation, God created Eden, a garden, and the idea is that was to be God's temple. God created all of existence, and on earth he created a spot called Eden as his place where his presence would be, so that he could be in communication and have a relationship with his creation. And within that temple, the dwelling place of God, the one spot in the entire creation that he created where he would exist in order to connect with his creation, he created people. So he didn't create people and then come to people. He created a dwelling place for himself. He created a temple, a house, where he gets to kick back and relax and play Xbox and do whatever he wants all day long. You know, it's his place. And within his place, he created people, starting with Adam and Eve. And something happened, we're going to talk about in this video, something happened which broke the connection of God, and people then lost the knowledge of God. Even though they're living in his house where he is, they've lost the knowledge of God. And so God establishes this program through this thing called a covenant, which is a program of revelation. He slowly, over years and years and years, reveals himself to his creation that's lost the knowledge of him. And that's what the covenant is for. It's progressive revelation. He slowly introduces knowledge of himself to his creation in order to bring his creation back into relationship with him, as they're all living in his house and they don't even know it's his house. The second key concept is this. The focus of creation is the establishment and maintenance of order and operation. It's not random. There is no example that exists of something that is not alive suddenly creating something that is alive. Death doesn't give, birth to life. Life gives birth to life. And that's an order that God has created. God created everything. So if you want to think of it as the Big Bang, go ahead and think of it as the Big Bang, as God says, let there be light. Bang! Suddenly creation comes into order. Life gives birth to life. That's the idea here. And then there's meaning and there's order and there's purpose behind that. Because the purpose of the order and the operation is to help people connect with God, so that we understand the nature of our being, we understand the nature of creation. It's to be in a perfect relationship with God and enjoy what he has established for us. The third concept. The stories in the Bible are stories about God. So, for example, we're going to look at the story of Adam and Eve. It is not about Adam and Eve. We're going to look at the story of the fall. It's not about really the fall. It's all about God. As we progress through, we're going to look at Judges, and we're going to see some people in Judges that we may call heroes, like Samson. The story is not about Samson. All of the stories, the key figure, the key person, the key character in all of the stories of the Old Testament are God. And people often make a mess of their story. Yet in spite of our mess, regardless of our mess, God continues to move his plan to reveal himself to us and bring us back into relationship with himself. So all the stories in the Bible are actually about God. So often when we read the Old Testament, we try to create heroes out of the people that we read, like King David, who like the golden days of Israel, or Solomon, the wisest person to have ever lived, the golden days of the Jews. Not about them. When we attempt to create heroes out of the names, out of the people in the Old Testament, we get it wrong. We take the emphasis off of God, we put it on people, and then we begin to normalize some of their behavior as though they behave in a way that we should be copying. And that's not true. The lead character in all of the stories is God. People are always doing wrong, and God is always making sure that order and operation is maintained in order to bring people back into relationship with himself. So he works through all of the mistakes that we do. God is the hero, and we see lots of names that we're going to love and perhaps be familiar with, but the lead character is always God. Here's some key terms. So those are 3 key concepts, talking about the covenant, talking about the establishment of order and operation, and talking about God as the main character in all of the stories, particularly in Genesis, which is a narrative. Here's some key terms. There are several key terms that are important to keep in mind while you are reading through Genesis. So I'm going to let you know what they're referring to. The first, the big one here, is the fall. The result of the disobedience of Adam and Eve is that it brought sin into the world and alienation between God and all of people. We call that the fall. That God had this great relationship with Adam and Eve. And one of the verses I love in the book of Genesis, after the creation event, is that they were naked and knew no shame. I love that because it tells us that there was this perfect, vulnerable, truth-filled relationship that people had with each other and that people had with God in the temple, in the house that God had built for himself. And then he invited us to be in that house with them because his desire was to have a relationship with his creation. So what is the fall? The fall is Adam and Eve basically saying, I don't want you. I want what you have. I want what you know. And so they chose, knowledge over God. They wanted to be God themselves, and they disobeyed. They broke relationship with God. That's the fall. And so we got disconnected from knowledge of God. We got disconnected from the blessings. We got disconnected from eternal life, which began what we live in today. Whatever it is we want to say that is wrong with the world today, all of that began with the fall, when Adam and Eve chose to disobey. The next key concept is the flood. The flood was, as you're going to read, God's judgment on the world. Now we could say it was due to their lawlessness and violence against each other. And the text says only Noah was a righteous man, so his family was spared. What also is going on behind the flood is that the world was on a trajectory, a path, to continue to live as it was living without the knowledge of God, and the opportunity to discover the knowledge of God was very quickly vanishing. And so this was a bit of a rescue as well that God had made for the world to bring them back on a track that would lead them into at least having accessibility to knowledge of God, so that then the possibility remained of them coming back into relationship with himself. So the world was such that people had lost all knowledge of God and were on a path to no longer looking back and no longer wanting knowledge of God. And this is happening in God's house. So God cleans up a bit, and he takes the one guy who is showing signs of still wanting knowledge of God, and he says, okay, I'm going to continue with you. And then humanity basically gets a restart. And this theme of the flood, it will be repeated in Revelation. Notice the themes and notice what's going on in the book of Genesis, because there are over 300, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but when you read the book of Revelation, there are more than 300 references to the Old Testament, and many of the concepts that we find illustrated, symbolized, using metaphor in the book of Revelation are actually found right here. So like the reset and the starting again with a smaller group of people, a remnant. That idea initiates right here with the flood. The world was on a path of forever being without the knowledge of God and not wanting to return. And so God hits a reset button and keeps the remnant, keeps people who are demonstrating some kind of desire to actually know who he is. Okay, Tower of Babel. There's another key term here, Tower of Babel. Babel was a building project. And we could say that it offended God. We could say that. It prompted him to confuse the language. There was a problem with the Tower of Babel. So after the fall, people began to, and after Noah, people began again to create a culture that led them away from the desire of knowledge with God. And actually, they got so pompous that pompous, I guess, full of themselves, that they made this ziggurat because they felt that they could create their own gateway to the astral plane, the spiritual reality of where the gods existed. And at the top of that ziggurat was apparently a bedroom and a gateway to to wherever the gods were supposed to have existed. So it was really their attempt at saying, we are our own God. We are the God of ourselves, and building a culture that, again, was hostile to God's attempts at reconnecting humanity with himself. So God's like, forget this. So he confused the language. The Tower of Babel is where the languages were confused, and we would say that that would be the point in the Bible where the nations began to form, because people all had the same language, same culture back then. And then at that point, God confused the languages. So lots of people spoke in different languages. They all separated according to their language groups. And this is the beginning in the Bible story where nations began to form. That would be the Tower of Babel. Patriarchs is another key term. Patriarchs. And you're going to notice patriarchs even in, like all throughout the Bible. These are the founding ancestors of the nation of Israel, which is also very important in the Old Testament story. Very important. They're the founding ancestors. So there was Abraham, and then there was Isaac, and then there was Jacob. So Abraham, we're going to discover, is the person that God gave an initial promise to. He built a covenant with him that Abraham would be a blessing to everybody, and everybody would be blessed through him, and his family would be too numerous to count. They'd be like the stars in the sky, the sands, the little pieces, specks of sand on a shore. That's how many children he would have. Okay, so birthright is also another key term to keep in mind when you're reading the book of Genesis. So we're talking about inheritance after the death of a father. The birthright went to the firstborn, the oldest son. Now, the firstborn received twice as much of what was to be given from all of the other sons. So if you have 12 sons, it would be the inheritance would be split up into 13 subgroups, and the oldest would get 2 of those portions, and the others would get 1 of those portions. That's how I understand it, and I think I'm right. So they got a double portion of the inheritance. So if there were 2 sons, you'd break the portion, you'd divide it up into 3 portions. The oldest would get 2 portions, and the youngest would get 1 portion. That would be birthright. And we're going to see why that's important as we read the story. Yahweh. Okay, this is cool. Okay, this is cool. This is basically the personal name of God that's given to us. And you might ask, okay, but what about Jehovah? For so many years, I've heard the name Jehovah. And if you've been going to church for a long while, you may have heard songs like Jehovah Jireh, my provider. Anyways, what's with that? Okay, well, Jehovah, as it turns out, was a translation error. And we may get into that later, but we have figured out where the translation errors come from, and we've corrected that. And so you no longer see the name Jehovah in modern translations because we've figured stuff out. And the name Yahweh, it's just 4 letters that we've added vowels to. The name Yahweh is what was given to us for God's name. And here's the final, key term for us to know as we read back to the word covenant. Specifically in Genesis, it's God's agreement with Abraham that really we want to look at, and his descendants, that he would bring blessing through the world. So remember, the covenant is the idea that God uses to establish his program of self-revelation. The covenant is what he uses to reveal himself to people. So in the Old Testament, God wanted to be known through the covenant. In the New Testament, that's changed. God wants to be known through Jesus. Jesus is God, and so God wants to be known through and as Jesus. In the Old Testament, though, because we have lost the knowledge of God, and as progressive revelation, God slowly reveals himself to humanity who generally doesn't want to have him revealed to them because they want to be God unto themselves. They want to be their own authority, autonomy. So God uses the covenant to slowly reveal himself. And the big revelation in Genesis anyways starts with Abraham, because God calls Abraham. He says, follow me. I'm going to bring you to a promised land, and I'm going to create you into a nation. I'm going to start with you and you alone, the first patriarch, and I'm going to create you into a nation. And that is through the covenant. Here's some key teachings about God. So there's 4 key teachings about God that you're going to discover through the book of Genesis. So keep this in mind. So while you're reading, ask yourself, I wonder if what I'm reading right now, knowing that God is the key character, he's the hero of all the stories in Genesis, I wonder if one of these lessons is what's trying to be taught to me through this. Because Genesis, historical narrative, it's a narrative for the point of teaching theology, teaching something about the knowledge of God. And so it could be connected to whatever you're reading. The purpose of the narrative isn't to create somebody, put somebody up as though they're the hero. The purpose of the narrative might be to teach you something about God along these 4 key teachings. Here's the first idea. God established and maintains orders in the cosmos. So God created, nothing. From nothing, God created that into something. So there was nothing, created into something, and then he creates order into that. So in the first creation account in Genesis, with the 7-day cycle, you'll notice that in the first 3 days, it's a poem. In the first 3 days, God creates a space. Like he creates day and night, but it's not until the second set of 3 where he fills the space with sun and moon. So that's God's creating order. So it starts with nothing, which we might say ultimate chaos, but it starts with nothing, and then he creates spaces to fill, and then he fills it. And then the 7th day of creation, he gets what he wants. He has established his temple on earth, which is rest. He's now at home with his creation, doing what creation he was designed for, and doing what Eden and the planet Earth was designed for, which is to be in relationship with God. So no more work. God has got what he wants. And what he wants is this temple on earth, this house on earth, so that he can be with his creation for the purpose of relationship. So that's the maintaining of the cosmos. That's he's the one who holds everything together. Second key teaching is God overcomes obstacles to carry out his plan. So we're going to see that people had largely rejected him, complicated what he asked. I mean, basically, start with Abraham. God calls Abraham and said, hey, Abraham, follow me. I'll show you when to stop. You just start walking. I'll tell you when to stop. And where you stop, that's going to be the promised land. I'm going to lead you to that. And Abraham kind of obeys God, but he obeys God by sort of adding something to the plan by saying, hey, father-in-law, you come with me. And it wasn't until after father-in-law passes away that Abraham actually then gets to the promised land. So God continues to carry out his purpose. And in the Old Testament, that would be to be made known through the covenant. God continues to carry out his purpose in spite of what people have done to complicate things. Here's the third teaching out of 4. God reveals himself to his people. The idea of a mystery is, I'm not sure if it really is totally pronounced, like really thickly, so you can kind of see it. It's alluded to in the New Testament. In the New Testament, we see that there is a mystery of what God is intending to do, and a mystery. This is the kind of mystery that you can't solve. It's the kind of mystery that needs to be revealed. For example, my youngest daughter is still having spelling bees. A Friday of every week, there's a spelling bee, and she gets 10 words she needs to memorize, and then there is a secret bonus word. And with the secret bonus, so there's 11 words. If she gets that bonus word, then she'll get an 11 out of 10, which is very cool. And she's so excited about that. But that 11th word, that secret word, isn't something for her to be able to discern. She can't puzzle that out. It needs to be revealed. And so this is the nature of our relationship with God. God isn't something that we can use our massive brain power to figure out. Pretty much God is hidden from us. We can't access God on our own power. We can't build a ladder up to heaven and pull back the curtains or open the pearly gates and say, oh, that's who God is. We can't do that. We don't have access to God. And so God then is a mystery to us, and that mystery, though, is only solved with his revelation of himself. So God reveals himself to his people. And that's something that you're going to find in Genesis, that as God kind of shows up, as God is passing knowledge about himself, people don't know who God is. In Genesis, that's the idea, that people have lost the knowledge of God. And so God is trying to bring the knowledge of himself back to the world. And he's really laying it on thick with Abraham, because through Abraham, a nation is going to be established, which will be a beacon of light for the rest of the world, so that people will know where the center of knowledge about God is to be found, and that's through the covenant that God has with the nation of Israel. And then fourthly, God's grace exceeds all logic, where people may have been, would have been right for God to judge people, would have been right for God to say, forget it. God made creation to be basically his house. Like Eden was to be his temple, his house, where he hung out with his creation. And then his creation's like, forget you. I'm going to take over your house. You go in some corner. We're going to take over this house, and we're going to forget you're even there. At that point, God could have got out the broom and the dustpan, swept us out, put us in the incinerator, put us in the trash, and said, I'm going to start again. That would have been logical. But God doesn't use that kind of logic. He uses grace. He's motivated by this love and a desire to be in relationship with his creation. He wants to draw us back to himself. He's motivated by love. He's not motivated by wrath. And so grace exceeds logic. Where he should have given up on us, where he should have swept us into his dustpan and thrown us into the garbage, he has not done that. He's been motivated by love, and so he operates with a great amount of grace toward us and continues to set up these covenants, these relationships, to draw us back to himself. Okay, that's all introduction of the book of Genesis. Let's talk about the purpose. This isn't the first book to be written, by the way. This is the fifth book in the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is that part of the Bible which is the first 5 books of the Bible, which can also be referred to as the law. This was the 5th one to be written. So during a time of exile, after they had lost their nation, Genesis was written to be more pastoral, to remind the people that there was purpose behind creation, and there was purpose for the establishment of them as a people, and that there's still a plan moving forward. So let's talk about the purpose of this book. Its purpose is to be a story of God as he continues his relationship with his creation. It's meant to include all the disappointments and all the actions that he takes to overcome those disappointments in order to move his plan of reconnecting all of creation to himself forward. He shows mastery by creating order and bringing order to his relationship with people through a covenant. So again, a recurring theme, he takes what is in chaos and he brings it into order in order for a relationship with him to be attainable. The purpose of the book is to show us that sin, this initial rebellion against God, and this continued sin is what separates God and people, so that people no longer had an accurate idea of what God was like, who he is. And that continues today. We do not have an accurate idea, perfect knowledge of who God is, and it stems back to the fall, the idea in the key concept in Genesis. This is why God made a covenant, with chosen people, with Israel, with Abraham. Abraham and his family was to be a relationship that would help give people a better understanding of what God is like. So let's talk about the story just a little bit. So in the first 11 chapters is really recording tracing the blessings that's recorded in Genesis 1, 28 to 30. The genealogies are showing people being fruitful, multiplying, which is God's command, be fruitful and multiply, spread out through all the world. And that command, of course, was disobeyed in Babel. They weren't spreading out. They were being one people. At the same time, though, these chapters, they also show the advancement of sin and people moving away from God and knowledge of him. And we see that through the disobedience of Adam and Eve, and we see that in Cain murdering his brother Abel, escalating, family escalating into violence. We see it in the flood that people moved away from God, did not want to have any knowledge of God. And then we see in Babel people attempting to build a stairway to heaven so that they could access God and force him to come down to their level, proving that they now are equal to God. In addition to the problem of sin, bringing people who didn't want to be in relationship with God back to God, Eden's problem, where they said no more relationship. We also see the problem of restoring the lost knowledge of God, which is really the Babel problem. They don't have any knowledge of God, so they're building a stairway up to heaven in order to access God and knowledge of him as equals. That didn't work. Human initiative, first by Adam and Eve, then by the builders of Babel, had devastating results. And so God, he covenants with Abraham in order to, this is God's initiative to provide a way of accessing knowledge of God through Abraham and his family, and eventually the entire world would have access to a knowledge of God through the nation of Israel. And at least that was the plan. The patriarchal narratives, which are found in Genesis 12 to 50, those are the stories of the patriarch as the initial fledgling nation that begins to kind of launch through the individual founding families. It traces the advancement of the covenant and the blessings. And at the same time, they show all the obstacles that we're facing. And those obstacles were overcome, not by people's ingenuity, although the stories sometimes are misunderstood so that we think that the people in the stories were the heroes. And yay, they saved God's plan. That's what's going on. People are adding complication, obstacles, and God still comes in and he fixes it. So God continues to demonstrate his mastery over his own creation and protecting his desire to bring all people to himself. Here are some key verses. There are 4 key verses that I want to share with you through here. So this might be where a discussion starts this coming Sunday when we're trying to figure out a way to talk about all that's been shared in this video. Here are 4 verses that maybe we can refer to as we discuss. Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and increase in number. That's very important, particularly to understand the why behind some of God's activity, like maybe the Tower of Babel. That would be helpful to know. Genesis 12, verse 3, All peoples on earth will be blessed through you, namely speaking of Abraham. So this would be the idea of God revealing himself to the world through the creation of a nation to be a beacon of his knowledge to the rest of the world. So God is making himself, the knowledge of God is being made accessible, starting with Abraham and giving the promise to Abraham. Then the third verse, Genesis 50, verse 20, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish the saving of many lives. So there was a story of Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers, and eventually he became highest in the land, just next to Pharaoh, and ultimately saved his family who sold him into slavery. And Joseph was able to provide a commentary on that. He said, yeah, that really hurt. That was really horrible, but this is what I discerned. God used my moment in slavery to set me up as the highest authority under Pharaoh in the land, so that when famine came, God had a rescue plan that he could bring you to a land that was not totally devastated with famine, so that you could still thrive. And the last verse I wanted to make mention of, we're going to go back to Genesis 3:15. It says, I will cause hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. Now here comes the big part of it. He will strike your head and you will strike his heel. So this is God speaking to the serpent who deceived Adam and Eve to eat that forbidden fruit and enter. And this is around the fall, and sin comes into the world at that time. The reason I point this out is because this is the first prophecy in the Bible about Jesus. And of course, the original readers of Genesis would not have looked at this as though it was specifically naming Jesus. But they would look at this as hope, because that's why Genesis was written. Genesis was the fifth book in the first five books in the law, in the book of in the Pentateuch. It was to be a book of hope. It was to be pastoral, so that as we're going to learn about the exile as we continue this Old Testament survey later, the people of Israel, the nation of the Jews, they needed hope. They needed to be reminded that all of this has purpose. And God is still in it. God still has a plan, and they haven't been forgotten. Even though they've been exiled, they haven't been forgotten. And so this is a nice shining beacon of hope. He will strike your head, you will strike his heel. Even though things have gone wrong, God still has a plan to make things right. And so the correction of what has been wronged is, or made wrong, is out of your hands. The text kind of says God himself is going to do something to make what has been made wrong right again. And so it would be, Jesus would be the one who's stepping on the serpent's head. So the idea here in the New Testament is that, Jesus went to the cross, kind of like the serpent biting Jesus' heel. But he rose again, Jesus rose again, which was the ultimate crushing of the head of the initial deceiver, so that there's no more permanent problem with sin. Sin has been taken care of, and the plan to cover up a sin or overcome sin would be faith in Jesus. Okay, I'm going to pause here in our survey of Genesis, a little bit longer video. I'm only going to do this once a month. It's going to be teachy, just like this. So maybe write down some notes and consider what it is you want to talk about as we meet together. If you've got any questions or something you want to just gab about Genesis, make sure you come prepared, because I'm still going to be doing close to observation, interpretation, application. It's going to be a little harder to do that, though, because we're not actually looking at text right before us. So come prepared a little bit to talk. If you would like to join us, we meet 2 times on Sundays, once at 1:30, once at 6:00 p.m. This will totally be a little bit more of a Bible study. And anyways, still a great time to connect. So would you please ask for the Zoom link for community, creating community spaces so you can connect with others and also with God. I'll see you next time.